All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's parent class. My name is Sarah Smith, Communication Support for Tumwater School District. For tonight's topic, impacts of social media and safety on the internet, which is taught by Miss Candyce Lund-Bolinger. Tonight's class will be our last class of the school year. If you would like to see any prior classes, please head to the TSD website where we have all of them posted. Also, Candice and I wanted to bring up this evening, for next year, if you have any suggestions on topics, you can please email me at the district office. You can also call me, but my email address, I have a chat. I'll put my email address in the chat. And if you guys wanted to email me with topics for next year, we'll get those with Candice and we'll kind of brainstorm a little bit. We would like to take a moment and thank Candice for all of her time with these classes and her knowledge and her compassion throughout all of these classes. It has been quite an honor to have you.
Thank you.
For tonight's class, we do ask you to not record the class yourself due to confidentiality of others attending tonight. If you would like to rewatch this class, we will be posting it to the TSD website. I will also be keeping a close eye on the chat if anybody has any questions for me. And without further ado, Miss Candice, please take it away.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started in terms of talking. There is so much to talk about now. So it's probably been about 10 years or so when I first started talking about managing technology and social media. And since then, we have a whole lot more information, both research and subjectively. So I want to talk a little bit about in general, but there's so much to say that I'm going to be talking like crazy tonight. It's become such a huge issue for families. And so please don't hesitate to unmute yourself to ask a question or ask a question and let Sarah give it to me, because I will be talking fast and furiously to try to get some of this information across. And it doesn't mean that I'm not open to getting some info or questions from you guys. So I want to start by first of all saying that it isn't your imagination that the complexity of parenting has so significantly increased with technology, exponentially increased with technology. And when we first started talking about this, there was this continuum of sort of the neuro enthusiasts who were super excited about the idea that our brains were going to be starting to work with computers. And then there were on that continuum the neuro alarmists and everywhere in between in terms of even the professionals. As we have gotten into this with more time, in terms of neurology, of brain function and impact, we're definitely seeing we're moving towards more of the neuro-alarmist end of the spectrum. And so part of the problem right now is that your children are basically born into being digitally, or what we call tech native, where their brains are starting with this technology and they're so much more natural with it than we are and function more sort of naturally in it than we do, and or maybe even are interested in doing. And so I want to start prefacing this a little bit with a little bit of history. I'm going to throw my glasses on because I just keep writing tinier and excuse me, tinier and tinier notes because I have so much I wanted to tell you. So I want to preface by saying that as I start to talk about this tonight, I really want people clear that my intent is not in any way to make parents feel guilty or somehow that they are doing something wrong or bad. I just want them to be really aware of what we do know now, so that they have more tools to take action and to have a little more innovative approaches to this. So history-wise, one of the things I want to make really clear is that, I said I started doing this 10 years ago or so, um, and so it wasn't until actually 2005, I think, when the first text happened. So we didn't even see texting until 2005. I think Instagram came out in 2015 and TikTok in 2016. So literally, I've got to turn this off. Hang on. So literally, there is just absolutely no way that parents could have in any way even thought about what these impacts were going to be, or how quickly this was going to be part of their parenting process or integrated into your kids' life experiences. So for most of us, we grew up with thinking of really as technology as just being tiny TV screens that were now on, phones or iPads or watches or whatever. Not understanding, I don't think any of us really understood the difference between what we now know as passive screen time and interactive screen time. And what most of we are now seeing is what we call interactive screen time. So as a result of that, there was sort of this idea, well, it's not that big a deal. We all watch TV and it didn't seem to impact us too much. And so that's where we came from. It's the history in terms of how technology has developed has happened so quickly that really it's taken this amount of time to even get the research to know what we've been dealing with. So right now it's about 4.5 billion users of TikTok and Instagram. And 2 out of 3 13 to 18-year-olds use TikTok an average of 20 minutes a day. The average age for kids to get smartphones now has moved down to below age 12, just a little below right now for the average. So what we're seeing is not only are things developing, but kids are getting exposed at a younger and younger age. So there's been a lot more research. They've started doing a lot of research on sleep patterns, which I'm going to come back to and talk about in a minute, dopamine release in terms of executive function. But there are other things as well that I just want to talk a little bit about. One is the effects of multitasking. What we know is that our brains are not designed to multitask. No one's brains are. And a lot of kids believe that their brains are literally designed and working to multitask. But every study we shows that that is not the case, that we do what's called task switching. And task switching means that we may be doing homework online, for example, and then switch over to text someone or message someone or search out music or whatever. And when we switch those tasks, what we know is that we are less efficient and we make more mistakes. So one of the things that I've been working with the kids is really understanding that they're going to be more efficient. It's going to take them less time if they learn to compartmentalize their work, like do a half hour of, English, and then switch tasks, stop doing English, text some friends, search out some music, and then go back and spend another half hour doing math or whatever they might be doing. That when they switch every 5 minutes, they are literally going to take much, much longer and make many more mistakes than if they learn to compartmentalize. The other one I want to talk about just quickly is the effects it's having on language. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing that kids are struggling more with spelling, for one thing, because in texting, there's a lot of shortening. Writing, there's almost another language around spelling. And so we're seeing an impact on spelling, on grammar, punctuation, because they are not something that we use or value in texting. So we can talk more about that later as well. And then I'm going to talk more about real life versus and life experience versus technology. So now what I want to do is I want to, before I spend a lot of time on screen, concerns. Some of the concerns have been, and I'll just flip through these, but I want to come back and really talk now about why these concerns and what we've seen in research around these concerns. So the average screen time for American children is around 45 hours per week. That's 7 hours and 38 minutes a day. Those of you who are teachers, especially secondary teachers, know that that includes in your classroom, that many of the teachers that I'm talking to now have basically resigned themselves that kids keep their phones and text through classes, that they don't anymore put their phones away. So that 7 hours and 38 minutes is more time on the phone than they spend in school. We're concerned about the impact on sleep. With the latest research, more concerned about the impact on sleep. Your kids should be getting approximately 9 hours of sleep a night. This is through high school. The average high schooler is getting 6 or less hours per night right now, and of sleep, and we're seeing it impacting in lower age as well now. The impact on motivation and agitation. We saw that there was an impact, but we didn't totally understand the impact until we got more research, which we'll be talking about because it's directly related to dopamine addiction and so on. Pancake thinking is another concern we've had. And the pancake thinking concept is that we all have access to very quick information about almost everything on the internet, which in some ways is, as we all know, really helpful and really efficient. On the other hand, it leads to what we call pancake thinking. Those of us before who did our educational brain development before all the technology have what we call a deeper thinking, because we had to learn to process about things, read them, look them up, go deeper into them. With this quick access, we have what's called pancake thinking, where kids have a lot of information, but very superficial information, not a lot of depth of information or depth of intellectual processing. So that's what we call pancake thinking. ADD is still a concern and also a vulnerability. So what we now know is that kids with ADD actually are more vulnerable to some of the technology impact. And we know that we're seeing what is ADD like behavior as a result of some of the exposure to technology, which we'll talk about. The piece about having concerns about developing executive function, not even a question anymore. We'll talk about that extensively tonight because we are well aware that it's having an incredible impact on executive function. And I'll explain more about executive function here in a little bit. Physical well-being, the same with that, which we'll talk about tonight. It's not only a concern now, it is truly an issue now of physical well-being, both mental and physical. The ability to access outside resources. This one is one that we haven't had a lot of research about yet, but what we are starting to see is that kids are more comfortable accessing information and resources online. So, for example, they can order a pizza online. They don't have to talk to someone. They can make some appointments online. They don't have to talk to someone. As a result of that, what we are seeing is that as kids get to an age where they have to start interacting in an adult world, that they are having a lot of anxiety and probably, I would say, social skill or grace in terms of having to access outside resources that are not on the internet. In terms of their comfort zones, they are not comfortable in accessing. Impact on social graces and civility is truly there as well, for the same reason that they're not getting that same interaction, personal interaction. What's interesting about the impact on social graces and civility is that in the social graces and civility are also changing as a result of technology. So it is now considered rude in terms of social graces by a large number of people to actually call someone without checking to see if they want to take a phone call. So we're seeing what used to be considered to be detached or natural to call someone as now being rude rather than texting them and seeing their availability. So we're going to see changes in what we consider the graces and social behaviors and civility as well. We'll talk a little bit about influencers tonight and some of the concerns around that. We'll talk and see it very directly about how come parenting is becoming more difficult, why we're seeing an impact on emotional intelligence, an impact on nature deprivation. Nature deprivation is basically that concept that kids are not exposed to the natural environment. And as a result of that lack of exposure to environment, we know there's a direct correlation with anxiety, as well as that when we look at the environment deprivation and nature deprivation and the environmental concerns, the more they are detached, the less they are attached to trying to protect the environment. So invested in protecting the environment. So we're in a critical place where we definitely need environmental protection and are having kids who are more and more detached about that. And then the impact on in terms of their entertainment and the comfort of them self-entertaining and entertaining other ways besides screen. So what I think I want to start with is spending some time, because there's so much more information now on addiction, on dopamine, which is a biochemical that's released, and the impact on brain. So let's talk about what we now know is happening. So in terms of dopamine, dopamine is a biochemical that is released in our brains that is basically what we call a reward spike. So when we have something pleasant happen, we'll release dopamine, these spikes of dopamine, which are the feel good biochemical in our brains. Now, as we get more and more social media and technology, we get more and more of these. Food, for example, raises dopamine 50%. And so if you eat something pleasant, you'll get a 50% raise in your dopamine spike. Sex is about 100%. So having sex will raise your dopamine spike about 100%. Cocaine is about 300%. And if you look at social and gaming, for example, they will get spikes of about 100%, equivalent to what you would have in terms of having sex. But the difference is that sex, for example, would be a short period of time. And when you look at something like gaming and or social media, you're getting hour after hour, day after day of these dopamine spikes. And so we'll talk more because I want people really aware of what's happening and why the technology is developing the way it is and why it makes your kids vulnerable. Because this content of so much of what your kids are exposed to, both in social media as well as in gaming, the content is designed to give those spikes. So what we now know is that exposure is both brain altering, literally brain altering, and mind shaping. And for a lot of people at a really, really vulnerable age. So we know that our adult brain begins to develop at puberty. So between 11 and 14 is when we have the what we call brain pruning, where we literally start forming new synapses that will eventually be our adult brain at 25. So in our most vulnerable ages, all of these things are happening with us as a result of screens, which means it's definitely changing brain, altering brains. What we now know is that we're seeing dense gray matter shrinking, which was a shock and terrifying. We're seeing white matter shrinkage depending on the amount of technology and screen time they have. And we know that brain changes also happen now with sleep deprivation. The problem here is that we're seeing more and more sleep deprivation because we're having kids who are both staying up late on their screens longer, some all night, and some are not going into deep sleep because they are staying on semi-alert in case they get information, a text message, etc., during the night. So with the interface of sleep deprivation and the interface of the dopamine impact, we're definitely now starting to see brain changes. Now it's what we call the prefrontal cortex that we're seeing the majority of changes in. That is basically the area of where we have executive function. Executive function is the last part of the brain to actually fully develop, again, usually by age 25. As a result of this, it's what we know is it's very much impacting and slowing down ability to predict consequences, impulsivity. Basically, what they're seeing is that we're actually priming the brain for impulse, which means they're not only vulnerable and more vulnerable at this age to become addicted to screens, but also because of that brain priming, they're becoming more vulnerable to other addictions as a result of impulses. So it's where you learn to control emotions. It's where you get focus. It's how you develop following directions well, managing your time, self-regulation. All of that is executive function. So one of the concerns they're seeing as they're starting to do brain research is they're actually seeing what they're calling childlike dementia as a result of some of that gray matter shrinkage and white matter shrinkage. So they're seeing kids who are having memory challenges, cognitive delays. So all of this now is becoming something that's no longer a concern, but an issue in terms of health and development. So questions before we talk any more about this whole dopamine piece?
I do not have anything in the chat.
Okay. I'm going to assume we're okay, so I'm just going to keep going, you guys, but please don't hesitate to interrupt me. So we now know and have seen pretty consistently recognize screen addictions. And screen addictions are basically things like decrease in personal social interactions, where kids would rather be on screens than to hang out with friends or to participate in a sport. They're having more and more trouble, for example, actually getting full athletic teams because kids don't want to turn out because they lose screen time, for example, and it's easier. School and academic failure is becoming more of an issue. Losing interests in other activities, which we already see as part of a brain issue from 11 to 13, but now is extending beyond 11 through 13. So impulsivity is becoming more common, and aggressive and moodiness. All of those things I just mentioned are basically characteristics of addiction, and very similar to the characteristics we see with a chemical stimulant, which dopamine basically is a natural chemical stimulant. As a result of that, what we also see is that when that stimulant is taken away, we see basically the same thing we would see when someone is basically deprived of a chemical stimulant. So you'll see them be very agitated, sometimes to the point of real aggression. They are very much moody. They are feeling like nothing is interesting. All of that is when you're getting a dopamine withdrawal. So it's important for parents to be aware of what it looks like as kids are becoming addicted to screens, and what it looks like when we have deprivation from screens and the biochemical response. Psychologically, what they're finding is they're not having the same initiative, effort, or resiliency. So screens are a really easy, very fast way to get those spikes, to get that reinforcement, and much easier than going out and exercising, much easier than having an interaction with friends where you actually have to have some skills, where you have to read people, where you have to read their signals, where you have to communicate back and forth. So it's easier to do social media than it is to do life. And as a result of that, was where we're seeing less initiative, less effort to do things. So we now have less boys in college than we've ever had in history. We have fewer people doing, well, what I should say is we have a lot of people doing late driving. We're seeing much more resistance to having to even learn to drive. Whereas in the past, I'd say 20 years earlier, people could hardly wait to get their license and drive. Now what we're seeing is that kids do not want to get their license and drive. It's too anxiety producing. They don't look forward to having to put the effort into it. And as we also are seeing late dating, we're also seeing much later sex. So in some ways we could say, well, there's some good things that are happening as a result of that, but it's not happening for a good reason. Is everybody clear about this? It's happening because they're getting those spikes they would get otherwise with personal interactions and normal human development are coming now on screens, and they're coming easier. It's much easier than dating. It's much easier than, you know, having to form relationships and drive. So the other thing is that with that overstimulation, with that constant dopamine spiking, we're seeing that it makes everything else seem really flat and not that interesting. So kids are less likely to want to do new things, try new things, go new places, etc. They also have what we call hyperarousal, where they are so constantly in that higher state of arousal that it's really difficult for them to self-moderate. Difficult enough that I want to make it clear to parents this idea that you want to let your kids learn to self-moderate their screen time is probably not a realistic expectation at this point. So that's where we are at in terms of sort of the psychological impact, the dopamine, the brain impact, and so on. So questions before I move on.
I am not seeing anything in the chat.
Okay. So one of the things now that we kind of switching around a little bit, one of the things that we're really concerned about is that in terms of brain development, children only use what they see and hear. And the internet now is their main source of information, by far their main source of information. It's one of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight that we can start to do to try to counter some of this. But I just want to make it really clear. It's like it is incredibly challenging for parents to even begin to want to compete in that issue of being a source of information. And we'll talk about how to do that a little more. Again, making it really clear that are all screens. I'm just reading your question.
Yeah,
here.
I just saw that come up too.
Okay.
Are all screens equal in these concerns? Looking at a music playlist, a batch of photos on the phone.
Good question. Yes. So no, the answer is no, they're not all equal. What we know is that the things that are more likely to spike are things where you get some kind of emotional response. And so gaming, for example, would be different than watching a TV show. A social engagement where you're actually interacting would be higher than looking at photos, for example. And so that's really a good question to ask, because we know screens are not going to disappear at this point. But as you're beginning, or hopefully will be beginning to pay attention to what your kids are doing, I think it is really important to be able to be clear about which of the things are going to make them more vulnerable to these outcomes and which things are going to make them less vulnerable to these outcomes. It's a bit like Russian roulette in the sense that, you know, there are probably a lot of different things that impact this vulnerability. One is the brain development. One are the natural predispositions that different people have, for example, to addiction. One would be what's happening around them in their environment. Are they already depressed? Are they already anxious naturally? One of the things might be, for example, if they are very high functioning in other arenas, like they're already doing sports, they're already interested in other activities. And so they're less vulnerable in that way. So, but we don't know, and that's the scary part of this, we don't know which of those kids are going to be the most impacted. We have seen kids impacted within weeks of exposure. We've seen kids impacted in months, and we've seen in weeks, months, years of impact. And we can't predict it. Like, we are seeing really high functioning kids academically who are actually getting addictions as well, and quicker than some of the kids who are not as high functioning academically. So we're not clear yet about how all of the different ways our kids are necessarily vulnerable to these brain impacts, which is part of why I'm saying it's a bit like Russian roulette right now, similar to why we don't exactly know who is going to be able to do drugs recreationally and who will become addicted to drugs. So it's the same kind of concern that we have around that. So now I'm going to make a little switch here, and I want to talk a little bit more about sort of what we're seeing in terms of our kids' impact in terms of the internet, and then what we can do as parents in terms of that. And before I do that, I want to spend a little time explaining, because I think part of it is really having some understanding about these platforms like TikTok and Instagram and the Meta stuff, is that those platforms' goals and processes are to basically create the most addictive content possible. The whole idea is the more clicks you get, the longer you stay on, the more advertising you get. And so the way this becomes profitable is to get people addicted. So they want them to stay on longer and go more often. Now, what happens is, as you click, what forms are what we call algorithms, where they can see basically what makes people keep clicking on things. And again, that content is basically designed to get that click. And so it's based on engagement. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, it matters if you get clicked. So let's say that you see something you absolutely think is horrific, or you absolutely disagree with it. If you click on it or respond to it, you basically are reinforcing that information to come up again, because it really gets more clicks. You get way more clicks with intense subjects, intense stimulation, than you do with feel-good stimulation. They don't get a lot of clicks. People don't click a lot on nice things. They click on intense things. So those algorithms are designed basically to do that. And they're designed to seek out vulnerable people, including children. So at this point, one of our concerns is that these platforms are not accountable to anyone. So in terms of like radio and that kind of thing, we have accountability. There's the federal, what's it called? Is it FCC? I think it's FCC. There's FCC, you have to report to. There's only self-reporting in these platforms right now. So they only have to self-report at this time. So we're concerned with, because people will argue, well, it's a matter of what they would call freedom of speech. But really, it's not a matter of freedom of speech. It's a matter of freedom of reach, because it's not that these different ideas, information, content are getting equal exposure. They are not. As these algorithms form, and as people are more emotionally triggered by something, those algorithms are getting content that you will get more of that content. So it is not equal in terms of speech. In a way, you are, and your kids are, getting force-fed information. So I just want people to be aware of that. So when we used to talk about it's important to know where your kids are, it's like there's a lot of reassurance, I think, in this generation in some ways where parents could have sort of a sense of, my kids are at home, my kids are on screens, I know exactly where they are, which feels actually reassuring in some ways. But what I want people to be really clear about is it's important to know who your kids are with on those screens. So just to give you an idea, there was a study done where they basically had 4 different countries, had people sign up for as a profile of a 13-year-old. And in that profile, what they found was in 2.6 minutes, that 13-year-old was getting content of self-harm. By 8 minutes, they were getting content that it's okay to have an eating disorder and to tell you how to eat 700 calories a day to stay looking like a person who is thin. In 9 minutes, they're getting self-harm is a viable way to deal with issues they're having. In 7 minutes, they are getting Andrew Tate talking about misogyny and disrespect of women. And so this is all happening. Andrew Tate, by the way, got kicked off, but his YouTubes are still on. And so there are a staggering number of your kids who are getting this information really quickly and really consistently. So what I'm trying to get people to understand as we start to talk about managing this in your family and with your kids is being really clear who is teaching your kids. It's like we literally cannot compete because I would say most of you are not spending that much time, 20 minutes a day minimum, of giving information about how you believe, what you believe in terms of sexuality, in terms of gender, in terms of health and safety, in terms of values on a daily basis. And then the consistency of those messages over and over again. That if you have talked to your kids, for example, about eating disorders, it probably was a conversation about eating disorders, not conversations over and over and over again about these subjects. So there's just no way that parents are in a position to actually compete with the internet and the internet content. So what I want to start with here is being really clear is that we have to start by educating ourselves. Very much so, we have to do that. What I'm finding as I'm talking to parents is I'm finding that, number one, a lot of parents don't really want to educate themselves about it. They aren't really interested in a lot of the internet content or process. And so it's hard to educate yourself when you're not interested. But it's important to do that because what I'm trying to get people clear about is you've got to get to a place where you expose yourself to what they are seeing. This is probably the most important thing I could say tonight, is that you want to be interactive with your kids so that you can coach them in terms of what they are seeing and have discussions about what they're seeing and knowing what you need to have discussions about as a result of what they're seeing. And so it is incredibly, incredibly important that we educate ourselves. The second thing about this is that if your kids are now on any of these sites or have access to these sites, or even if their friends have access to these sites, then you have to assume they've had exposure to these things we've been talking about: self-harm, suicidality, um, Andrew Tate, all of that. So you have to make that assumption rather than waiting to talk to them about these subjects. You've got to start talking about these subjects and start competing with who's teaching them. So you want to be sure that you know what your kids are seeing and doing. You want to be sure that you know what your values are, that you're really communicating your values regularly and over again. You have to be as repetitive as the information they are getting repetitively online. You want to be sure you don't let fear be your driver. What I'm seeing is, and understandably so, because I do believe it's a bind, is that we all are aware of how important it is for us to continue to have rapport with our children so that we can continue to have relationship at a level that we can continue to communicate and coach them as they move into this adult world. So parents are very concerned in this generation about their rapport with their kids. As a result of that, they're very fearful about intervening with their screens because they get such strong responses from their kids as a result of that brain impact I'm talking about. So they're fearful of that interaction with their kids and having any kind of controls around that. So the recommendations have been 2 hours per day. We all know now that that's almost impossible because the majority of their school content is now on screens. So we're having to really sort out is like, how much time are we talking about? Probably still 2 hours in terms of social media or gaming per day maximum, with the understanding that we are talking, even about in those 2 hours, we are still talking about getting those dopamine spikes that some of your kids are going to be more vulnerable to and will lead to screen addiction. Now, this is really, this is interesting and difficult because parents who I'm dealing with now who have kids with serious screen addictions, and it's heartbreaking, just as we would be heartbreaking with drug addictions, and they are being treated in many ways similarly. There are now clinics and professionals who work with the addictions. And what we're seeing is that we've had parents who've been very intentional about this process. They've talked about it as with the information that they knew 5 years ago. They tried to be proactive about that. And we still have kids who were great in terms of school academics, in terms of sports, who now have severe addictions and are not functioning outside of their addiction without help. But we're still recommending 2 hours. Family rules, I'm still going to come back to that. Is we talked about this years ago, and I would still say we really need to look about what are our family rules going to be about screens. The issue here now becomes we are seeing a lot of, and you probably recognize it yourselves, if not in yourselves, around you, of adults who you know also are dealing with screen addictions now. And so, you can't say one thing and do another. It's like we really do have to have basically family rules about how screens are going to be managed. The idea is that you want now to really join your children on social media because you want to see what they're exposed to, so that you are able to actually have some actual dialogues about what they're seeing, about what you're learning, about what they're learning. They probably are going to have to teach you in order for you to join them. That's fine. And that might be a great way to actually engage them, is to actually want to have them teach you, because it gives them a little bit of power. But we really need to know who and what they are getting exposed to online now. I want to be sure people know their sites, know what the apps are, know how they function. I want to be sure that you're not using them as a sitter, particularly now with what we know. Using screens as a sitter is what I'm talking about, particularly with what we know now, because there would be no way in the world that we would ever allow a babysitter to expose our children to some of the content that they are getting exposed to regularly, starting the age of 13, sooner if they have access to these sites. And so think about it that way. It's like, would you let a babysitter expose them to self-harm videos? Would you let a babysitter expose them to eating disorder sites? So really say to yourself, I can't allow myself to use screens as a sitter, that I want to think of it as something where I have to be interactive with them in order to be able to counter some of that impact. We're still saying and encouraging people to really, really limit devices in their rooms, ideally not at all. This was really hard, that it kind of got out of control with COVID. But I want to make really clear that what these things that we saw in terms of the impact, like one of the things that I want to come back to, I'll talk about some of the impact again in a minute, is that we saw some of these things that were really emerging pretty seriously in 2019 before COVID ever happened. So it isn't just a matter of this all was a result of the pandemic. We were seeing these same things starting to happen and accelerate long before COVID. So it really is a matter of, did they escalate? Probably. Did we get more dependent on screens? Absolutely. Did we have less energy to really deal with the screens and allow kids to have them in their rooms and so on? Yes, we did. And so I want to talk about, again, it's like, if at all possible, try to be sure there aren't screens in rooms, that kids don't go to bed with phones and say they need them for alarms, that there are other ways for them to listen to music or set alarms and so on, that we really want to be sure that we're not interfacing this screen time with an exposure with also sleep deprivation. The big one that all of the researchers are saying now is delay, 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 delay. The longer you can hold off every year from their perspective is a gift in terms of what they're seeing in terms of direct brain impact. So the longer you have where they're getting their chance for their brains to develop and the chance for them to get other life experiences, more life experiences, the better. So anything you can hold off and delay. We want to be sure parents are involving school. So it's interesting right now. We know that Seattle School District is actually, I believe, suing Meta because of what they're seeing in terms of impact, which is really, I'm happy to see that some of the schools are doing that. I know in the UK, they had so many boys that were exposed to Andrew Tate that who right now is in prison or in jail waiting waiting to go to court on human trafficking. But so many boys between the age of 12 and 14 were exposed to Andrew Tate and his belief system that they now actually have people coming to the schools to deprogram or attempt to deprogram these boys. It was so common. So we are seeing schools recognize and start to do things. It's really important that you contact your representatives and senators. Incredibly important now because for one thing, there was a bill that actually was brought up. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it was Kids Online Safety Act, something like that. That actually was a bill that just didn't get voted on in time in last session and went down. But there has to be some way for us to try to hold some of these sites who are developing the content and who know darn well what the content is doing. There's been plenty now of whistleblowers that have said they absolutely do know that the content is having negative impacts on particular areas of health and well-being for children, for example, and are continuing to say they didn't know or they don't think it does, but we need something to hold them accountable so they aren't just self-reporting at this point with no accountability. So getting a hold of your senators and your representatives and saying, we really want something done with these platforms and approach to content is also really important at this time. It's also really important that you be sure you have resources. So I'm going to give you some names. If you get a chance, Sarah, write these down because we can put them on the site. There is Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is not just about digital hate. It's got a lot of good information, and they are constantly trying to keep up with research and the platforms. So again, Center for Countering Digital Hate, which also has a really, really excellent parent guide and that you can download off of that same site. And then, as I said, they'll keep up with research. They have a new video out, I believe, called in terms of social, the impact of social media, called Deadly by Design. Another good video, if your kids haven't seen it, is Social Dilemma. There's another one called Fake Famous. There's several excellent TED Talks that are really good. And what I'm trying to get parents to do is expose their kids to this, because in this age, this vulnerable age of brain development from 11 up through 25, it's like there really is a lot of concern about control in terms of adolescence, power and control. And I think for them to be exposed from someone other than you saying it, explaining and talking about how these platforms are consciously controlling them and taking their power away, basically, is really helpful for them to want to not be controlled by someone else or something else. So it's important that they get this exposure. If you feel like you have had in fact been in a place where you think there is addiction, I want people to be aware that you can do things like electronic fasting. It takes, they now know, 2 to 3 days to really undo the biochemical impact of the dopamine. So if you're going to try a detox, like go somewhere and unplug the whole family, for example, figure it's going to take 2 or 3 days for a reset. What you'll find, though, is, and some of you may already have found, is that your kids are so violent and so aggressive and so reactive that you are scared to do it yourself, I want you to be really clear. It's okay to be reaching out now for professional help. And there are several screen addiction clinics in Seattle right now that you can at least contact and get some support from to do that. The other thing I want parents to do as early as possible is to try to do what they are calling psychological immunization. Psychological immunization concept is that they want kids to go as long as they can with as many life experiences, as many other activities, as many exposure to many diverse interests as possible. That if we can get kids more fully developed and more fully exposed, they're hoping that they'll be less vulnerable to sort of fend off sort of what they consider digital viruses. So it's like they're sort of looking at the medical model and calling it in a psychological way. So they call it psychological immunization. They call that vulnerability to addiction basically digital virus. So that is some of the things that parents can be thinking about and trying to do. Now, with that said, before I talk a little bit more about some of the things in terms of physical well-being, are there any questions or comments or?
I don't have anything in the chat, but if anybody has anything, please feel free.
Yeah, you can just unmute yourselves if you have questions. Okay, so we know that impact that and going back to concerns again, that impact on motivation and agitation is directly related to that dopamine exposure. And so again, as your kids get that stimulation and get it so easily from their screens, they are less tolerant of when those screens go off. Nothing seems nearly as interesting or as pleasurable. Everything looks boring, and they can become incredibly agitated. That is just that dopamine withdrawal. The bigger concern in the long run is the long-term impact of that, which is seeing them want to do fewer and fewer of what we would call normal developmental milestones through adolescence, because it's more work and more anxiety producing than what they can do online. So that's one of the things that I wanted to circle back around to. In terms of physical well-being, depression is definitely skyrocketed, has anxiety. And as I said, we saw this trend happening before COVID. So we could say that COVID may have escalated it, but we saw this trend moving pretty quickly long before. So eating disorders have increased 17% since 2019. Self-harm and suicidal has increased 12%. Obesity has increased. And so self-esteem has definitely decreased. Body image issues have definitely increased. And so we're definitely seeing incredible physical well-being issues come up. Are any of you familiar with what's called, I think it's called Bold Glamour? Bold Glamour is a TikTok filter, and it's a newly refined TikTok filter that immediately does all kinds of facial things. It puts a beautiful makeup on you. It basically changes the shape of your face. changes the texture of your skin, sometimes the color of your eye, the shapes of your nose, etc. And they're not doing it. You just plug it in, the filter comes up and changes you. And so what they're seeing is that is incredibly impacting how young people are seeing themselves in terms of their natural beauty. And instead of feeling better about themselves, they're feeling worse about themselves, because when they see themselves without that filter, they feel ugly. Now, one of the things that we know has been a really negative impact of social media is that there's a lot of what they call the comparison effect. And this bold glamour is sort of the ultimate impacting comparison effect kind of filter. So, but you were getting it, they were getting it all the time. And that comparison effect is what is constantly they're being barraged with, that undermines their sense of capability and attractiveness, etc. So that's the word that we're using for that. Influencers, if you aren't familiar with what they are and who they are. So Andrew Tate, for example, is an influencer, considered an influencer. And those are people that basically are people who are, quotes, influencing your children and saying what's important, what's valuable, etc., way more than you are. And that's why we're concerned about, are you clear about who your kids are being influenced by, what content they're being exposed to, and so on. So that's the issue around the physical well-being, and suicidality is up as well. All right, so other questions about what this is? A lot, I know, of information. And I guess what I'd like to say about this is I just want you to be aware and concerned enough to get more information. Get to these sites, see some of these videos, start watching what your kids are watching. Start getting ready to start countering some of the information they're watching. Start to get more proactive about seeing if we can get some of these platforms to have more accountability, get some of these acts from Congress passed, etc. So, questions?
I have nothing in the chat, but please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Brandy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for this information. It's been really helpful. I just had a question around if you had any advice on how to partner with schools or how to get schools buy-in. I was really struck by what you said about that it's difficult for these kiddos to self-moderate and that expecting them to do so isn't necessarily realistic. But,
Right.
For our kiddo in those middle school years, it seems to be the expectation that he's getting more and more freedom at school in ways that, we're seeing some of these negative effects and wanting to partner with the school and get on top of it. But the message seems to be, if he's doing well academically, it's not an issue. And that's
right. And that's not the truth. And I think, part of this is just ignorance, is what I want to be really clear people are understanding. There's no maliciousness. There's no neglect in this from parents, from teachers, from, whoever. It really is ignorance, is that we were so unprepared for how this technology developed. We were unprepared for what these platforms were doing and could do. And so they believe, as I was talking about, they're from a generation of where TV wasn't that bad. And so I think the piece is to really try to get the schools more educated. Are the teachers seeing some of these videos? Are they looking at this research? Are they understanding that we're literally seeing brain changes? Are they understanding about the dopamine spike issue? Are they, really understanding this? So, because we have to get them to buy in.
Right, right.
If they don't understand what's happening, we don't get the buy-in from them. And I think the same is true probably politically when we're talking to, your representatives, your senators. It's like screen time sounds like such a minor issue, but it is such a major issue when you think what this may mean for the future. Yeah. In terms of generations of kids who are having these impacts. And so I think really educating and asking to see that they are having programs to educate themselves so that parents can partner with them.
Thank you so much. That's so helpful.
Yeah. All right. Somebody else had something. I can't.
Yes, Danielle.
Yeah,
okay.
Actually, so before Brandy was speaking, I was actually thinking in my mind, because I am an elementary school teacher as well as a parent, I was thinking what resources are out there so that I can appropriately talk to my students about the effects of social media and too much technology use. And because it's interesting, a long time ago, I've been teaching for 15 years now. And in the beginning, it used to be, what do you want to be? Kids would say engineers and police officers, and they had a wide variety of things they wanted to be. And now literally every beginning of the school year, kids want to be YouTubers and influencers. And I ask them if there's anything else, and they're literally like blank on ideas. And
exactly, Danielle. I mean, we're seeing exactly the same thing all the way up. It's like, it's exactly what we're seeing. And what's hard about this is that because of brain development, because of lack of life experience, the kids don't know that stuff isn't real.
Exactly.
So for example, influencers are, talking about putting on this dress and going to this event and doing all these amazing things. And 5 minutes after they've done their spiel, they're getting their jeans on and watching Netflix. They don't know that influencers aren't real. They don't know that these things aren't really happening. And so I think, again, like I was saying, is that we really have to just really educate ourselves. And that's why I think that, having the resources that I listed before, and I'm hoping, Sarah, that you were able to get those down. If you're not, you can email me and I'll send them to you again, and you can get them on a site, because I think we really, really both have to look at these resources ourselves and see these studies and listen to some of these TED Talks and really look at some of these videos and go to these websites that are doing research and educate ourselves so that we basically can educate the kids and parents about this. Because
I'll reach out to you to get those sites.
Okay,
I kind of scribbled a few of them down, and I thought, oh no, this is just going to be
that's fine. You just reach out to me and I'll email them to you, and then you can put them on your site. One of the things I was going to say that I think is really hard about this now is that it's become so entrenched. It's really incredibly hard because it happens so quickly, and we just had no idea of how it was impacting. And as a result of that, I think a lot of people are incredibly overwhelmed and resigned. Like they just don't know what else to do. They don't know how to stop it anymore. They don't want to fight about it anymore. They feel like they're just fighting constantly about it. That's what I meant by it just exponentially has made parenting so much more difficult at all, already difficult times for some parents. And so I think there's a lot of powerlessness and resignation. And I'm, you know, I think one of the things we can do is try to see if we can get parents and educators to feel more empowered and less resigned. And part of the resistance, for example, I've heard complaints, and this is subjectively, from teachers, for example, in high school, that used to be trying to police people having their cell phones and turning cell phones off and not texting through class, and having things like if they did it, they would have to take their phones down to the office until the end of the day. If they did it again, parents would have to come pick it up. Well, parents got upset because of, quote, safety issues and with school shootings, et cetera, that they said, no, do not take my child's phone away. We want that child to have their phone all day. And so teachers have just given up. It's like they lecture with kids texting, and kids will tell me, we text all day long. We text through class. We don't stop texting in class. And so, you know, there's such resignation and such sense of powerlessness. And I think that the best we can do right now is just to really get ourselves educated and people around us educated, try to get some control over the content, if nothing else, that our kids are getting exposed to, and be able to support each other, because I'm finding that parents don't get really a lot of support from each other, because there's sort of this, well, their child gets to game, so why shouldn't my child get to game? You know, their child got a phone at 10. Why shouldn't my child? My child's saying everybody has one at 10 now. So it's really hard for parents to support each other. So I think we're really trying to get more information, education, and get a sense of more people to come together to really address this issue is important. Okay, anyone else?
So I have a question. So both of my kids, when it comes to, I want to listen to music, and so they get their phones and computer, but then of course later on it turns into, oh, I just wanted to message my friend for a minute. So do you have any other suggestions? Because I like to put my phone on the counter, but I mean, both my kids are managed to get their computers to be able to talk to or to listen to music, and then they end up talking to friends and then going on YouTube. And so it's just, what suggestions do you have?
I mean, we're still really suggesting no screens in rooms at night.
Mm-hmm.
We really are. We're still suggesting screens be in public places, not in bedrooms at all, ideally. And, but the resistance, like I said, is so intense because the kids have had it. It's much harder to treat something than to avoid it. That's why sort of the new approach from everyone now is delay, because once they, you know, to stop it is so much harder. But you would have to be able to really say, we're going to do this as a family. All our screens are turned off at 10 o'clock. And there is, you know, we have basically hardware now that people can download and turn off phones, screens at a certain time of the day. And well, so go ahead.
My concern is the music aspect, because both of my kids want to listen to music, and it's like my son, that's where his music is on the phone. So at night wants to listen to music, and I don't want to say, well, you can't listen to music, but then I don't want him on the phone. So it's not like I want to go buy something else separate. So I'm not, I guess I just, and same with my daughter. Well, if I'm going to clean my room, let me listen to music. And it's like, okay, that's separate, but all the music seems to be on the electronics then, and then they get their little paws on them.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think, I mean, anybody want to chime in here? Because I don't know enough about other technology. I know that some of the parents have basically have Alexa in their kids' rooms, and they can listen to music on Alexa, and they can get their playlist lists on Alexa and listen to Alexa at night.
Okay.
So that I know some people are doing that. Does anyone else have anything that they've done or are doing around music? The alarm issue is a non-issue. We can get alarms.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah, we've talked about, we haven't done this one yet, but we talked about pairing his iPhone with a Bluetooth speaker in his room, and then we'll set up the playlist because he listens to audiobooks at night. And so doing that, a more remote control, it's kind of like Alexa, but what we actually just went with just last night actually is we bought a fully separate kind of old school MP3 player that we're just going to put all of those things on it. And we are going to keep it separate because even with all of the controls that the phones allow us to select some things, he can just hack. He's found a way to like upload things into his alarms and he can get through it. And so we are just actually separating the devices physically.
Yeah. And my understanding is, from what I'm hearing people talk about, is that the hardware, downloading the hardware, they feel like they have more success than they do through their actual phone companies. So if you're struggling, look at some of the hardware. Oh, there's a question, I can't read it. We have
we have an old school MP3 player that isn't web or Wi-Fi connected to.
Okay. Okay. All right. Anyone else, you guys? I know, that was a lot of information tonight, and I know that it's alarming, I guess would be the word. It's alarming information. And like I said, my intent isn't to in any way make people feel guilty or make parenting harder, but I just want to say subjectively, I am seeing horrifically heartbreaking instances of screen addictions with high schoolers right now that I can't let's not say that we need to look at this and address this. Kids who can't get out of the house, kids who can't go to school anymore, kids who are violent with their parents. It's like we're seeing incredibly challenging situations. Okay, anyone else? Okay, I will get that information to put on the website for some of these resources, you guys.
All right, thank you so much, Miss Candice.
You're welcome. Nice that you. Oh, God.
Sorry, I missed what the website was. I came on a little late tonight, and I think I might have missed that.
Yeah, we're going to, I'm going to give that information and some of the other resources. I'll give that to you guys, and she'll put it on the website.
And then also too, in the chat, I have my email address. So if anybody showed up late, I have my email address for topics that you would like to see for next school year. This is our last class for the school year for the 2022-23 school year. But yeah, if you guys have questions, my email address is in there.
And Sarah, you'll put that on sometime this next week or so?
This class?
And the resources.
This class I'll probably have on the website probably by the end of the day tomorrow. It's usually a pretty quick process to get it posted onto the website. And then also on the website is all of this year's school year's classes. And then I think I have up to 3 years worth of your classes on there.
And then the resources for the media technology stuff that we talked about.
Yeah, I'll just send you an email and I'll have you kind of give me all of those web addresses, and then I can get them on there.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, you guys.
All right, thank you, Miss Candice. We appreciate you.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.